Now, you may remember last week the Prime Minister had a big dig at Derbyshire County Council, telling us that councils in his home patch of Oxfordshire were facing bigger cuts and handling them better. Well, we decided to find out if he's right. Jane Dodge has been down south to David Cameron land.
Welcome to one of the most expensive places to live in England. This is the Cotswolds, where houses come with big price tags. This is also David Cameron's constituency. He thinks his local county council could teach Labour-run Derbyshire a few things about housekeeping.
Derbyshire is actually being cut by less than the national average. People in Derbyshire, the funding they get is greater than, for instance, people in my constituency. So I think they've got some questions to answer about why they're cutting frontline services.
So is he right about funding? Well, yes and no. According to the government's own statistics, the national average cut to local government funding is just over 3%. The cut to Derbyshire County Council is less, at just over 2%, so Mr Cameron has got that right. But Oxfordshire County Council has seen a smaller cut, less than 1%, so he's wrong to say his constituency is getting less funding than Derbyshire. Rosalind Scott is one of an army of volunteers now helping to run libraries in Oxfordshire. David Cameron thinks other local authorities should do the same to protect frontline services. Rosalind Scott is far from convinced.
We are losing frontline services because it's the library staff that we're losing in the front line. So I don't think that's really the issue. I mean, I know the issue is to save money. And originally the proposal was to close local libraries, not to run them with volunteers. So the running them with volunteers was introduced as a way of preventing the closures.
David Cameron also thinks Derbyshire can learn a few lessons from this council about working with other local authorities to save money. Oxfordshire is sharing some responsibilities, but it's also transferred others to Hampshire County Council, 54 miles away. Down the road from the city's dreaming spires, the Conservative leader of Oxfordshire is grappling with the reality of cuts in funding. He doesn't see comparisons with Derbyshire as helpful.
I think it's always interesting to look at different areas, but it's actually not about politics. It's about delivering services to the locality. And of course, Derbyshire are going to be delivering to Derbyshire their services. And I think what we've got to look at is what's best for that area. I'm more than happy to have a discussion with Derbyshire and say how we've saved money. But of course, it's different areas. It's comparing apples and pears. Back in Derbyshire, the Labour leader of the county council says it's the government who has to take responsibility for cuts to frontline services. And David Cameron's attack is ultimately about political point scoring.
If this was just Derbyshire making these cuts, if it was just Labour councils making cuts, he'd have a point. But it's not. In the East Midlands, we see Leicestershire, Staffordshire, Lincolnshire. All of those are Conservative councils, and they are all facing the same degree of cuts as we are and cutting frontline services. It's not about councils making bad choices, it's about councils being faced with impossible choices.
Libraries in Oxfordshire might be safe for now, but support for some of society's most vulnerable people is now at risk. The County Council plans to cut funding for housing the homeless by £1.5 million. Even David Cameron's local authority can't guarantee to protect frontline services.
Well, as two Derbyshire politicians, this is obviously a subject that you know quite a lot about. First of all, Yvonne, is the Prime Minister right to criticise Derbyshire for the way it's handling these cuts?
I think he does have a valid point. I think there are other issues that they could look at first before going out and saying they're going to absolutely cut a service. So, for example, their mobile library service, they could have gone out and looked at the voluntary sector and who could actually run it. Could other businesses run that provision? I don't think they're right to go out immediately and ask for cuts to the whole service.
Toby, we saw there in Jane Dodge's report that the figures show that the Prime Minister is right in one respect. Derbyshire is being cut less than the national average.
Well, what you're seeing is right across the country, the areas of the greatest deprivation are getting the biggest cut. So the 10 councils with the biggest cut, with the biggest deprivation, £782 per person in terms of the cut. The 10 wealthiest councils, £48. So I mean, absolutely massive difference. When you talk about it in percentage terms, it doesn't look quite the same. Derbyshire's around the sort of midpoint of all that. But the difference between the cuts they've had in Derbyshire and the cuts they've had in Oxfordshire, forget percentages, in pounds, shillings and pence, is absolutely hundreds of thousands of pounds. And for David Cameron, who's imposed these cuts on local government, front-loaded them so there was very little time to do anything about it, and said if you don't make these cuts, we'll send Eric Pickles down to run your council for them. For him to stand there and say they should learn from Oxfordshire is an absolute disgrace.
It's just not helpful, is it, Yvonne, really? To have these criticisms. I mean, people have just got to get on with the job. Cuts have to be made. Well,
you're absolutely right. People have to get on with the job, and actually the county
but the criticisms aren't helpful, is what I'm saying.
Well, they've been elected to run the council and to make those difficult decisions, and instead of blaming everybody else, including the government, they have to get on and make those decisions and take some ownership for their decisions.
But this isn't the first time that he's been critical of Derbyshire, though, because when he gave a formal interview to the regions, he does one every year, by the way, this is the second year in a row that he's singled out Derbyshire for criticism. Is this just electioneering? Some people might say it is.
I don't see it as electioneering. I'm sure he could pick other councils throughout the country that aren't necessarily doing what he would like them to do. Derbyshire just seems to have been on his radar.
It certainly was.